Well, hello. I'd like to introduce Kazuo Ishiguro to you, and I'd like to begin by asking an obvious question, perhaps, but nonetheless I think it's important. Oh, could you please say where you were born, the year, and then what memories you have of Japan? Obviously you were born in Japan, and perhaps also when you came to England.
It's like an application form. I was born in Nagasaki in Japan in 1954. At the very end of 1954. Yeah, what was the next bit? When I came to Britain. Yes,
no, what memories?
What memories?
I mean, I know, of course, I have the previous information, knowing you were born in Nagasaki, so obviously what I'm getting at is, do you have any memories of the bomb and the damage that it caused and your parents talking about it?
Well, there was very little obvious trace of the atomic bomb by the time I was born. The recovery was very rapid, the physical recovery of the city was very rapid. And so I was born almost a decade after the atomic bomb. And so it wasn't something that was very evident. And so I never grew up in Nagasaki thinking, well, I didn't grow up in Nagasaki, but the years I spent in Nagasaki, I never considered the atomic bomb as any kind of special issue at all. And I didn't subsequently, after coming to Britain, until I was relatively quite old, until I was 9 or 10.
When did you leave Nagasaki and come to Britain?
I was 5 years old when I left Japan, and I came over with my parents. My father being a scientist, who was going to work in this country.
That's a curious move, isn't it? I mean, to come and study science in Britain rather than Japan, which is.
Well, not in those days. My father's an oceanographer, and I think for some reason the British government found his research relevant to the North Sea. I think it was something to do with the North Sea. Whatever the reasons, anyway, we ended up in this country, and it was an odd kind of immigration, because I think my parents always assumed that we would return to Japan within 2 or 3 years. And so I was brought up as though I would have to be ready for the Japanese culture again in a few years' time. And then the stay kept getting extended.
You spoke Japanese at home then?
Yeah, I still do speak Japanese to my parents. And so it was an odd kind of upbringing. My parents, I think, particularly in the early years, were very conscious that I'd have to be brought up in a Japanese way, or at least there would have to be some Japanese values to compensate for the influence I was getting outside. Simply because, for practical reasons, if we were to return to Japan, I would find it very hard to adjust. But of course, that faded as time went on.
How easily did you learn English?
Very easily. I don't remember ever actually consciously learning it. And I think children of that age do pick up languages very rapidly. No, I don't remember a point when I was actually incapacitated because I couldn't speak the English language. And
your childhood reading then, did it consist mainly of Japanese children's books or English children's books?
Well, a mixture. One of the ways in which my parents tried to keep up the Japanese side of my education at home was that they subscribed to various educational digests, which are very much part of Japanese culture, or the equivalent doesn't exist here. But in Japan, children wade through these kind of big comic books which come out every month to correspond with what they're doing at school, which is a mixture of entertainment and kind of education. And my parents would go through these with me, well, my mother principally, and she would also read me a lot of stories in Japanese. And a lot of my knowledge of the Western classics actually come from the compressed Japanese children's versions of those. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables I've only ever come across in the Japanese version. And similarly with The Mousetrap, Agatha Christie's Mousetrap, I read a novelization of it, I had it read to me in Japanese, and I still remember it vividly. I know who did the murder, although I've never come across it in England.
Right, let's jump a few years now. and take you to university. When did you begin to write? Fiction, that is to say, not essays. Or when did you begin to want to be a writer?
It was, I wasn't terribly keen on the idea of becoming a writer for quite a long time. I always wanted to be a musician.
That's assuming you are a writer.
Oh, this is assuming I am a writer. Yes, well, I wasn't somebody who for a long time cherished the ambition to publish fiction. I always wanted to be a musician. That's to say, kind of a rock musician,
is this for Freudian reasons that rock musicians get more women than writers, or
that's not Freudian? It's fairly overt. No. I mean, a person of my age and my generation, with any sense, wanted to be a rock star. I didn't want to be a kind of some kind of highbrow literary person hacking away somewhere. And I was very much part of that kind of scene. I had a circle of friends who played and wrote music throughout my teens. I did this whole business about going around to record companies with tapes and playing in kind of strange places where people ignored you. And it was relatively late. I suppose at a point when it became obvious that I was too old to become a rock star. Let's say when I was about 24, 25, that I started to take the writing of fiction more seriously. It seemed like you had a longer lifespan in that world.
Yes, that is true. You're considered young, of course, till you're well over 40 as a writer.
Yes,
so plenty of time.
And I suppose I really started to take the writing of fiction very seriously when I applied to do an MA at UEA, that's to say, University of East Anglia, in creative writing. And at that time, it was the only course of that kind being offered in this country. And when I suppose I applied quite, I suppose quite hopefully, but I didn't really think I was going to be accepted because I was told that the standard was quite high. And so I was quite shocked when I was accepted, and I was rather frightened. I thought I was going to show myself up terribly. And the summer before I went to East Anglia, I wrote 3 or 4 short stories in a very kind of, in a very intense sort of way. And I'd never written like that before, taking everything very seriously, with a view to having it scrutinized. And I think that was the first time I actually applied myself very seriously to fiction, as opposed to writing a lot of kind of autobiographical dirge, which I did my share of while I was an undergraduate.
Let's just assume that we're being watched now by aspiring writers, so with time on their hands. So would you say that you got very much out of this creative writing course? I mean, did it advance your development, hinder it, or was it irrelevant to it?
It was a great help to me, because it gave 2 things that are very important, I think, for a writer who is starting out, and that's time and some kind of critical encouragement. But those are 2 things that are crucially lacking often. I mean, you said perhaps there are a lot of aspiring writers with time on their hands. I mean, often the case is that there are a lot of aspiring writers who perhaps don't have a lot of time on their hands, and they have to squeeze it in between the time they look after children or the time they go out to work. Or if they do have a lot of time on their hands because they don't have a job, often the other thing is missing. The sense that you're doing something worthwhile is missing. I think that there's a lot of pressure, psychological pressure on you to justify what you're doing. Now, one of the good things about doing something like the East Anglia MA is that it does create a lot of psychological space where you can say, for a year at least, I mean, you're supposed to be doing nothing but devoting yourself to writing. And that I found very valuable. And I think that is its principal virtue, I think, that course. Yes,
I mean, there is that sort of moment when you're doing the course, when you actually can be considered not only by yourself but by those around you as a writer. So there's that sort of existential moment. And if we can now perhaps move on to the novels. I wanted to ask you if you've always written about Japanese subjects, because the two novels, A Pale View of Hills and An Artist of the Floating World, both are solely concerned with Japan, although The Pale View of Hills is, the framework is in England. And if you did change from writing about English subjects to Japanese, when and why?
I don't actually think my subject matter has changed greatly as a result of my starting to write about Japan. Yes, I mean, I have written about, well, I should say I've written stories that are set in England, or in Europe, or America. I suppose it's principally the two novels that I've published that are my Japanese pieces, if you like.
Well, plenty of stories also that have been published.
Yeah, I guess so. But yes, there some of those are set in Japan. It's I don't think I write about Japan, and in a sense, I'm slightly dismayed at the way my books have been received in this country, as being of some sort of documentary, principally of documentary worth in providing an insight into Japanese society. Particularly my second novel has been reviewed in this way. If people have recommended it, they've recommended it on the grounds that this is a rather a unique opportunity to get a insider's view of Japan, which is at the same time a kind of outsider's view, because here you have somebody who is partly inside that society and partly outside. And I feel a little nervous about this. My concerns aren't principally those of what you might call a realist novelist. I mean, I'm not writing about a period of Japanese history in order to get it down in some way. It's a setting that I've chosen because it suits my themes.
Let's stop there then. Let's, if we could, just delineate what these themes are, or what you feel your themes are.
Oh, no, that's very.
Seeing, you've brought this up twice now.
I have. Themes. Well, of course. I mean, themes. The themes are, I suppose, I'm interested in, tend to evolve and change, but they normally have over the last few years centered around similar ground. That's to say, I'm interested in how people justify to themselves the kind of life that they have led. I think it's sort of, in a way, it sounds rather simplistic, but that I'm interested in people who try to, people who aspire to do something that is of some kind of moral value, or in their eyes, something of moral value, or something that will distinguish themselves, or something that as they see it, will give their existence some kind of dignity. And I'm interested in people who try to do this and somehow discover that they are, in fact, too ordinary to transcend the mediocre. But I'm interested in that urge in people to want to actually leave their mark or want to do something, and people who somehow come to terms with the fact that perhaps they don't have it in them, but nevertheless they have to somehow find a way of looking at themselves that gives them dignity. And so I'm interested in periods of history, such as Japan just after the Second World War, where moral values did a kind of topsy-turvy, when a lot of people who had spent their lives devoting themselves to something they thought was valuable are suddenly told by the society around them that, no, sorry, you were doing the wrong thing all the time. In fact, you were contributing to something evil, and we will now condemn you. I'm interested in that kind of situation, because then somebody, whoever, has then to somehow reevaluate their lives in the light of the new judgment that is being passed on them. They're being told that the things that they thought they could be proud of are things they should be ashamed of. And so I'm interested in certain historical periods because it allows me to explore people in that kind of situation. So that's to say, I don't feel I'm confined to Japan. I suppose I'm not intrinsically interested in Japan after the war. And there are periods in European history that suit my purposes as well. And yes, I have written about. I have written stories set in the West.
You do, though, keep making these disclaimers, because I remember when we played Cheltenham together, you denied any interest in Japan or any knowledge of Japanese culture, and yet...
This is a Cheltenham Literary Festival,
yes,
rather than playing Cheltenham Football Club.
No, Cheltenham Literary Festival. Not the ladies' college either. And I sort of protested at that. And I mean, I feel in An Artist of the Floating World, which is your latest book, so we'll perhaps concentrate on that now. There is, a deep understanding, or at least a deep description of Japanese society at that time. So, clearly you don't remember it because it was before you were born, how much research did you, in fact, do for this book?
I generally do very little research for anything. I have an odd relationship to stuff I come across when I research. I really don't know how to fit things in. So my method is that I make everything up, and then I do some research afterwards and make sure I haven't got something outrageously wrong. And if I have got a few things wrong, I adjust them. But yes, I mean, research for me is a kind of a checking up process. What's important for me is that you say that the book appears to have a deep knowledge of that world. Well, I do have a deep knowledge of that world, but it's because it's my fictional world. I know that world thoroughly because that's the world I've created, and I think that's important for any writer, wherever they're setting their work, that they know the world in which their novel takes place absolutely intimately.
Yes.
And so that, now, to what extent that world coincides with the Japan of the 50s, I don't know. I mean, it probably doesn't differ wildly, but at the same time, I suspect it's not absolutely accurate. And I'm not terribly bothered if it isn't absolutely accurate. I mean, what matters to me is that the book has a sense of authority about the world in which the fiction takes place. And that world operates by rules which serve my purposes. Not, I don't have a sense of fidelity towards history. Or, it's principally to what I want to do in my fiction. So that's how I make that world operate in the way that I want it to.
But into this world, this sort of semi-real Japanese world, there comes America as a sort of keynote of contradiction, as it were. I mean, the epitome of all the values that are now taking over in Japan. And there is the figure of the artist's grandchild, who wants to be a cowboy, etc. Was it the Lone Ranger?
Yes, Lone Ranger, I think.
Yes. I wonder how much, is there any autobiographical element in this figure? I don't mean do you want to be the Lone Ranger or did you want to be the Lone Ranger, but this notion of the person in whom these changes are actually noticeable, the different representation of sort of American Japanese culture, or shall we say, for purposes of this discussion, Anglo-Japanese.
Well, I would certainly have been like that long before I came to Britain. I knew about the Lone Ranger and people like that long before anybody ever had the idea of our family coming to the West. And so I was very fond of the Lone Ranger, who was on television at the time in the 1960s.
Did you identify with him or Tonto?
Oh no, yes, I identify with the Lone Ranger actually. Yes, and nobody identifies with Tonto, I'm afraid. Yes, I mean it was like it was something that I was familiar with, and I think this is a point worth remembering, that to a lot of Japanese of, say, my generation, the earliest images we have, a lot of the earliest experiences we have, comprised of this mixture of so-called Western things and Japanese things. And to us, they didn't have the impact of something coming from abroad. So as I say, when we came to Britain, a lot of things were alien. Things like the Lone Ranger struck me as quaintly familiar. I thought, oh, well, here's something from back home. Of course, for the generation earlier, these things must have signified something else altogether. But once again, I think it can be overstated, this business about American culture coming in and shocking people. The West had been infiltrating, if that's probably not the right word, but I mean the West had been penetrating Japanese culture for some time, ever since the opening of Japan in the Meiji era. And Japan had already gone through a kind of a westernizing craze at the turn of the century. And it was a relatively, well, it was a kind of a hiccup in that process when Japanese militarism took over in the late 20s, and the West, things Western were seen to be undesirable. Apart from that, you will see a fairly smooth and enthusiastic process in which the Western values were assimilated into Japan. And of course you see that this was all part and parcel of Japan industrializing and becoming a power. And so it went hand in hand with that.
Do you read contemporary Japanese fiction?
Just in translation.
Yes, I meant in translation. I mean, and do you feel more akin to that, or akin to what your contemporaries are writing in Britain and America?
I don't feel particularly. I don't feel any particular relationship at all to the contemporary Japanese writers. Well, I should say modern Japanese writers. A lot of modern Japanese writers have recently died, and that's in the last 15, 20 years. I think, like a lot of Western, just straightforward Western readers, I find a lot of Japanese which are quite difficult. But I do find it quite a challenge at times, because it often doesn't operate by the same kind of central rules that Western fiction often operates by. That's to say, the most conspicuous things to say about that is that Japanese fiction often does not contain a structure that relies heavily on plot and character, inverted commas, as a lot of Western writing is renowned to do, and a lot of contemporary Japanese fiction, and I refer to writing by people like Soseki, who is probably the most respected Japanese author of this century. You'll find his face on the 1,000-yen notes. Kawabata, Tanizaki. A lot of their works would appear in the West to be plotless and probably rather formless. I think Western readers read these things and don't quite know what the point of the books were when they finished. There is that kind of feeling, because there appears to be no central story. There doesn't even appear to be any strong characters in the Western sense. It seems to be somebody just burbling on about this and that, about everyday life. But this has been the literary tradition of Japan. And the idea of Western plot and character is something that was introduced relatively late in this century. That's a kind of a revolutionary angle on the novel. I personally find it quite challenging to try and find these if you like, alternative values of fiction in my writing. I'm not, by instinct, I'm not terribly fond of things like plot. I find it very restrictive. And I am interested in how you can move from A to B in a work of fiction without having the plot take you from A to B. So I suppose I do find an interest in it in that sense, but I can't say that I feel any deep affinity with Japanese writing. A lot of it is as obscure to me as it is to, I think, a lot of Western readers. Mishima, I should say, Yukio Mishima is an exception. I mean, it's no coincidence that he is well read in the West. He is, yes, I mean, all the things that the West like to think Japan comprises of, you'll find in Mishima. A lot of gore and perversion and fanaticism and a nice plot, you know.
I just wonder what you feel the input in your work is from the English language. I mean, because let's take it that you do write about, or the two books are set in Japan, if not about particularly Japanese subjects, if you have explained. What do you think is particularly English about them then? Obviously the language, but what do you think the language brings to them through writing in English about Japanese subjects? Because it seems to me that you can, when you adopt a language, or you can inherit that language's culture, but it's up to you whether you inherit its history or not. And it seems to me you've decided not to inherit its history by writing about Japan.
Yes, I mean it's a very difficult question. I don't.
It was meant.
Yes, I don't. I actually don't think consciously about language at that kind of line by line level. I don't think. I know some writers are very conscious of language at that level, at the level of diction and you know, the actual individual words. I mean, English is the language that I'm most familiar with, and I try to use it as best I can. I mean, I don't think I have a conscious stance on language at that level. Now, if you're talking about language as in its larger forms, let's say the fictional language. Yeah, if you're referring to the various techniques and the craft that is open to writers of fiction.
Well, it's not only that. I mean, it's also the inheritance you get of the 19th century novel, 18th century novel, and what your contemporaries are working in as well, of course.
Well, this relates to what I said previously about, I suppose, plot and character. I suppose my literary background is the Western kind of realist traditional novel. I suppose most of the actual books I read when I reached a kind of adult age tend to be of that kind of era. George Eliot, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy.
That one on English writers.
Yes, Western, I should say, Western realist tradition.
I don't think Dostoevsky fits into.
No, he doesn't, I suppose. But I mean, it's. Well, no, he does in many ways. I mean, it's only when you compare him to certain other people he looks a bit odd. But he looks pretty Western if you look at him in a global kind of way. So I suppose, I mean, I start from the point of thinking that in some way the normal dominant novel is one that operates around those kinds of values, and if I am trying to move away in some way, I suppose I'm consciously trying to move away from that kind of tradition. And as I said before, when I move away from that tradition, I find it sometimes useful to look at Japanese fiction, which operates by different rules, and fictions from other parts of the world. But I suppose principally I just sit in the room and think, well, I don't necessarily have to do A, B, and C. I'll try and do things my way. I'm not, on the whole, terribly conscious about this question of where I inherit my language or where I inherit my technique from. I mean, it's an interesting question, but it's not one that is the forefront of my mind when I'm writing. You know, I try to use English as lucidly as possible.
Yes. I think finally now, are you working on anything at the moment? Any fiction?
Yes, I'm trying to write something set in Britain.
A novel?
I should also say that I write screenplays for television films, and I've written 2 in the past year and a half. Both of those have been set entirely in Britain. So I do. It's not as if this is a great departure for me. I have recently written things set in Britain, and
the one that has been screened was about the butler who wrote the book, right?
Right.
And the new one is what? Is about what?
It's about a gourmet who goes around the world trying to eat things that have never been eaten before. He's a very English kind of upper class type, and it's set in London. And it is both of those pieces, I suppose, address matters English in a way. And I suppose I'm trying to write a novel that will take the kind of themes I'm interested in into an English context, so that I don't have all these people saying this book will give you an insight into Japan of a certain period.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.